Good evening, everyone. I'm Bernard Schwartz, director of the Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's reading by Ian McEwan. He will be introduced and then interviewed by Wendy Lesser. Along with his conversation with Miss Lesser, Mr. McEwan has also agreed to answer questions from the audience. You should have received an index card in your printed programs. If you have a question, please write it down and pass it to one of the ushers. Afterward, we invite you all to join us for a book signing in the art gallery just next door. Books will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Barnes & Noble. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank some of our seasoned supporters: the Greenwood family, the National Endowment for the Arts, Eva Usdan, Joan and Jack Jacobson, the Kaplan Foundation, Amazon, and the New York State Council on the Arts. And on behalf of the 92nd Street Y, I would also like to express my gratitude to City Councilwoman Jessica Lappin, who is with us tonight. Representing the city's 5th District, Councilwoman Lappin has been a longtime friend of the Y, helping to secure support for our capital needs and for our programs in New York City public schools. The Y's work in public schools, which reaches more than 6,000 students a year, includes programs in music, theater, dance, and visual arts. The Poetry Center's very own Schools Project, now in its 22nd year, arranges for meetings between students and authors prior to select readings. Such exchanges reveal literature as a living art and serve to inspire these students to express themselves via the written word. A member of the City Council since 2005, Jessica Lappin has worked on keeping public libraries open 6 days a week, as well as on the ever-pressing problem of overcrowding in our schools. The New York Times has praised her steely resolve, dedication, and energy, and our neighborhood is a better place for it. Please join me in welcoming Councilwoman Jessica Lappin to the stage.
Well, really, it is my honor to be here tonight at the 92nd Street Y for Ian McEwan's only New York City reading. And how wonderful that he chose the 92nd Street Y, which we know in this neighborhood as an icon, but is really one of our city's most precious cultural gems. And it's been my privilege and pleasure to support the institution. So it's a thrill to welcome him not just to Manhattan, but to my City Council district and to the Upper East Side. And also to welcome Wendy Lesser, who will be the moderator this evening. She is the founding editor of the Three Penny Review. Her most recent books are the novel The Pagoda in the Garden and Room for Doubt, which is a memoir. An editor, novelist, and critic, she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has been honored with fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. Please welcome Wendy Lesser as she introduces Mr. McEwan.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm very honored to be introduced by a city councilwoman, considering I'm not the main event, and Ian is. And I will be as quick as I can with the introduction because I know that you're eager to hear him read and then hear him answer questions afterwards. I won't tell you the titles of all his books and which ones were made into movies and so forth, because you can look all that up on Google. And instead, I'll try and express, I hope on behalf of all of us, why we're a packed house here to hear him read tonight. And the first thing I would say in that regard is that we do not really deserve Ian McEwan. And by that, by the we, I don't necessarily mean we here at the Y, or even we in New York, or we in the English-speaking world, but I mean we in the early 21st century. Because there's something about the way he writes novels that harks back to an earlier time. Not in terms of topic or style, but in terms of the way he cuts across boundaries that have come firmly into place since the 20th century and now even more in the 21st. In particular, the boundary between high art and low art. Something that's gripping to read like a mystery and a thriller, and something that's good for you and has beautiful sentences and is poetic. And Ian McEwan's writing doesn't side with one of those or the other. It insists on having both, the way, say, Dickens or Conrad did. And for the most part, that seems to have broken down in the world of letters, but not in Ian's case. I've been at several readings that he's given, and people have focused on this issue of how good the sentences are in his book. That seems to be the surprise, because the novels are so gripping and they have cliffhanger elements and all the things you associate with something that's fun to read. And once somebody in an audience said to him, "Why are your sentences so good?" And he said something like, "I think for a long time before I write each one down." And that seemed to be a rarity at the time, and probably even more so now. And I think that one of the reasons he thinks so carefully about writing English sentences is that he comes to them from a bit off to the side. If you ever have a chance, you should look up a wonderful essay he wrote called Mother Tongue. And it's about the fact that he was brought up in a household that did not speak proper BBC received English, as it was called. His family spoke with a regional accent, and they spoke in ways that didn't look like written perfect English and that had odd pronunciations. And when he went to school and eventually to university, he had to learn to speak the way other people did to fit in. And so he comes at English as Conrad did. I mean, Conrad came from a farther distance, from Polish and French. But Ian comes at English looking at it carefully and thinking about it and not taking it for granted. The way in which he's like Dickens, it seems to me, I think about those images of the people waiting at the harbor for the next installment of Oliver Twist or David Copperfield to come in. There's a way in which you finish one chapter of his and you must have the next. And then you must have the next and the next. And I don't think I've ever gotten a book of his without finishing the whole thing in one gulp. Sometimes the gulp takes longer than a day, but I find that every chapter practically is a cliffhanger. And many of the sequences in his books make wonderful reading aloud, so that you feel as if you're a child hearing a bedtime story, hearing him read these things. And, I mean, if any of you have heard them before, the opening section with a hot air balloon from Enduring Love, the car crash in Child in Time, where the car just manages at the last minute to fit through the little space under the truck, the body chopping up scene in The Innocent, and numerous other scenes like this make wonderful, gripping reading. So when I was reading the latest book, Solar, I asked myself, which of these things is he going to pick? And it was much harder than I thought, because there were several scenes that were gripping in this way. So I'm going to do a little cliffhanger of my own. I'm going to jot down two scenes that I think he might have chosen, and I'm going to put it over there where he can't get at it while he's reading aloud. And we'll see if he chose either of mine when we sit down to speak to each other. And at that point, some of your questions will come up as well as mine. But for now, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Ian McEwan to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you, Wendy, for a more than generous introduction. It's very kind. And it's wonderful to be back at the Y, probably the best place on the surface of the planet to give a reading, is my considered view. There are questions that writers who go on the circuit to talk about their work are frequently asked. And there's a certain kind of question known as the generic question. Like, how hard do you press with your pencil? And what were the beginning ideas of your novel? And, of course, the most famous one of all, where do you get your ideas from? That's the killer. These are known as generic questions, and what they signal to the writer, who might be on live radio or TV or in front of a live audience, is that he knows that the person asking this question has not read his novel. It's the kind of question you can ask of any novelist about any novel. But still, what are the origins? Just because it's asked frequently doesn't make it uninteresting. It is a good question. It forces one into a kind of narrative of beginnings that sometimes obscures memory itself. But for once, I have a pretty precise idea about solar, and I just want to talk about that before I read. In around about 2005 or 6, I was invited to Potsdam in Germany, near Berlin, to a climate change conference. I was invited by the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, her special scientific advisor, John Schellnhuber. And he had devised a gimmick. It worked very well for the press. Everyone speaking at the conference had a Nobel Prize, mostly in maths and physics and some in economics. And I was a sort of entertainment. I was to give an after-dinner speech. I was like sort of after-dinner mint among such presences. And mingling with 30 or 40 men, they were all men, each with a Nobel Prize, men of a certain age. These were figures of such grandeur, such a frisson of halo of ego and power and self-regard, and as well as awesome cleverness, that I'm quite struck by this, and I'd been thinking for a long time about writing a novel about climate change, and that's partly why I was at this conference, I suppose. I had no idea how to start. And immediately I thought, well, I'm going to award my character, whoever he is, a Nobel Prize. Because there is a kind of tragicomic quality to the Nobel Prize in Science, because it's often given for work you did as a very young person. And you're no longer that young person. You've got recognition. You might head grand departments. You might allocate vast sums of money to satellites or institutions. But you are not the young, lean figure who sat down and thought something that changed science in the path of it. The other beginning was to go with a group of artists and scientists to the Arctic, the Norwegian Arctic, for a week. We lived on a boat, frozen into a fjord in February, to observe the effects of global warming on the 80th parallel. In fact, we arrived in a cold snap. It was minus 45. Inconveniently, the glacier did not carve into the fjord. We were exhilarated by extraordinary scenes of pure air and gorgeous light. But the real point was this, that in the evenings we had these impassioned discussions about climate change and the science, but also the art and the responsibilities of the artists. But mostly they were driven by a great deal of idealism. The whole of the Earth, by convention, the North Pole's on the top of your map, the whole of our Earth was below us, and we wanted to change it to make it better. And meanwhile, just on the other side of the wall, was a room, a kit room we called the boot room, where you had to take off all your heavy gear, the outer sort of splash suits that you wore to drive skidoos, the helmets, the balaclavas, the underlining of the balaclavas, and all the rest. You had to take all this stuff off so that you didn't bring ice and snow into the ship. And this was a rather cramped, dark space under the wheelhouse. And as the week went by, I noticed that on the one hand was our impassioned discussion and our idealism, and on the other hand was the growing chaos of this boot room, where we couldn't find our stuff, and we would maybe just take that helmet, maybe it was ours, maybe not. And we clearly could not control this space. And it was at this point I thought, if climate change has any approach for a novel for me, it had to be along the lines of human nature. And so slowly, if you invent a figure of misfortune who's not particularly nice, who's rather overweight, and my Nobel Prize winner gets fatter and fatter through the novel, he overconsumes, you stand in the very long and very wide shadow, I suppose, of Shakespeare's Falstaff. And I guess John Falstaff lies somewhere at the back of him. So he's called Michael Beard. The novel opens with him in a bad shape because although he's a philanderer, constantly unfaithful to his 5 wives, I mean, he has his wives in sequence, I should say, for once, he is the cuckold. And so it suddenly brings him to a moment of self-recognition. And like many characters in novels, he conveniently looks into a mirror. It's one of the old tricks of the realist tradition. And it says here, catching sight of a conical pink mess in the misted full-length mirror as he came out of the shower, he wiped down the glass, stood full on, and took a disbelieving look. What engines of self-persuasion had let him think for so many years that looking like this was seductive? That foolish thatch of earlobe-level hair that buttressed his baldness, the new curtain swag of fat that hung below his armpits, the innocent stupidity of swelling in gut and rear. Once he had been able to improve on his mirror self by pinning back his shoulders, standing erect, tightening his abs. Now human blubber draped his efforts. How could he possibly keep hold of a young woman as beautiful as she was, she, his wife? Had he honestly thought that status was enough, that his Nobel Prize would keep her in his bed? Naked, he was a disgrace, an idiot, a weakling. Even 8 consecutive push-ups were beyond him. Whereas Patrice's lover, Tarpin, the builder, could run up the stairs to the Beard's master bedroom holding under one arm a 50-kilo cement sack. 50 kilos, that was roughly Patrice's weight. So Michael Beard starts this novel not only somewhat lighter than how it ends, but as a climate change, I wouldn't say skeptic, but I just want to put this in frame because he becomes a man of great passion on this matter. And he steps through a mirror of perception, and that's going to be the main point of my reading today. So Michael Beard was not wholly skeptical about climate change. It was one in a list of issues of looming sorrows that made up the background to the news, and he read about it, vaguely deplored it, and expected governments to meet and take action. And of course, he knew that a molecule of carbon dioxide absorbed energy in infrared range, and that humankind was putting these molecules into the atmosphere in significant quantities. But he himself had other things to think about. And he was unimpressed by some of the wild commentary that suggested the world was in peril, that humankind was drifting towards calamity when coastal cities would disappear under the waves and crops fail, and hundreds of millions of refugees surge from one country, one continent to another, driven by drought, floods, famine, tempests, unceasing wars for diminishing resources. There was, he thought, an Old Testament ring to the forewarnings, an air of plague of boils and deluge of frogs that suggested a deep and constant inclination, enacted over the centuries, to believe that one was always living at the end of days, that one's own demise was urgently bound up with the end of the world and therefore made more sense, or was just a little less irrelevant. The end of the world was never pitched in the present, where it could be seen for the fantasy it was, but just around the corner, and when it did not happen, a new issue, a new date would soon emerge. The old world purified by incendiary violence, washed clean by the blood of the unsaved. That's how it had been for the Christian millennial sects in the Middle Ages. Death to the unbelievers. And for Soviet communists, death to the kulaks. And for the Nazis and their 1,000-year fantasy, death to the Jews. And then the truly democratic contemporary equivalent, an all-out nuclear war, death to everyone. When that did not happen, and after the Soviet Empire had been devoured by its own internal contradictions, and in the absence of any other overwhelming concern beyond boring, intransigent global poverty, the apocalyptic tendency had conjured yet another beast. Well, Michael Beard becomes a passionate advocate of climate change, believing that he has a solution. But I want to pick him up now, full of that passionate conviction, late for a meeting, arriving in Heathrow. He hurried across the baggage reclaim, past the creaking carousels and bored crowds beneath the information screens, through the deserted customs, past the sinister one-way glass and the stainless steel examination tables like bare mortuary slabs, then out among the lines of dead-eyed drivers and their signs, Q8 balloon adventures, Bishop Dolan, Ted of Mr. Kipling, and crossed the departure hall, fully aware that he was not quite making a direct line to the stairs that led down to his train, nor was he quite aiming for the down-at-heel airport shop that sold newspapers, luggage straps, and related clutter. Was he going to be weak and go in there as he always did? He thought not. But his route was bending that way. Well, he was a public intellectual of the sort. He needed to be informed, and it was natural that he should buy a newspaper, however pressed for time. At moments of important decision-making, the mind could be considered as a parliament, a debating chamber. Different factions contended. Short and long-term interests were entrenched in mutual loathing. Not only were motions tabled and opposed, certain proposals were aired in order to mask others. Sessions could be devious as well as stormy. He knew this shop too well, and it seemed he was walking directly towards it now. He was simply going in to take a look, test his will, buy a newspaper, and nothing besides. If only it was pornography that he was trying to resist, then failure would do him no harm. But pictures of girls or parts of girls no longer stirred him much. His problem was even more banal than top-rack glossies. Now he was at the counter, sorting the pound coins from the euros in his hand, and with 4 newspapers under his arm, not one, as if excess in one endeavour might immunize him in another. And as he handed them across for their barcodes to be scanned, he saw at the edge of vision, in the array beneath the till, the gleam of the thing he wanted, the thing he did not want to want, a dozen of them in a line, and without deciding to, he was taking one, so light, and adding it to his pile, partly obliterating a picture of the Prime Minister waving from the doorway of a church. It was a plastic foil bag of finely sliced potatoes, boiled in oil and dusted in salt, industrialized powdered foodstuffs, preservatives, enhancers, hydrolyzing and raising agents, acidity regulators, and coloring. Salt and vinegar-flavored chips. He was still stuffed from his lunch, but this particular chemical feast could not be found in Paris, Berlin, or Tokyo, and he longed for it now, the actinic sting of those 30 grams, a drug dealer's measure. One last jolt to the system, and then he would never touch the junk again. He thought there was every chance of resisting it until he was on the Paddington train. He stuffed the bag into the pocket of his jacket, took up his burden of papers and his wheeled luggage, and continued across the concourse. He was 35 pounds overweight. About his future lightness he had made many general resolutions and virtuous promises, often after dinner with a glass in his hand and all parliamentary heads nodding in assent. But what defeated him was always the present, the moment of vivid confrontation with the affirming tidbit, the extra course, the meal he did not really need, when the short-term faction carried the day. His recent flight from Berlin was a typical failure. At the start, as he lowered his broad rear into his seat barely 2 hours after a meaty Germanic breakfast, he was forming his resolutions. No drinks but water, no snacks, a green leaf salad, a portion of fish, no pudding. And at the same time, at the approach of a silver tray and the murmured invitation of a female voice, his hand was closing round the stem of his runway champagne. A half hour later, he was ripping open the sachet of a salt-studded beef-glazed toasted corn-type sticklet snack that came with his jumbo gin and tonic. Then there was spread before him a white tablecloth, the sight of which fired some neuronal starter gun for his stomach juices. The gin melted his remaining resolve. He chose the starter he had decided against, quail's legs wrapped in bacon on a bed of creamed garlic. Then cubes of pork belly mounted on a hill fort of buttered rice. The word pavé was another of those starter guns, a paving slab of chocolate sponged encased in chocolate under a chocolate sauce. Goat's cheese, cow's cheese in a nest of white grapes, 3 rolls, a chocolate mint, 3 glasses of Burgundy, and finally, as though it would absolve him of all else, he forced himself back through the menu to confront the oil-sodden salad that had come with the quail. And when his tray was removed, only the grapes remained. He bought his ticket and settled himself at a table on the half-empty train. Sitting opposite was one of those young men in their 30s with shaved head, chubby face, and gymnasium-thickened neck, who were, to Beard's undiscerning eye, impossible to tell apart. This man, however, was distinguished by piercings in his ears. For some unacknowledged seconds, there was an under-the-table negotiation, a polite ballet for leg space. Then the young man proceeded with the message he was tapping into his phone, and Beard, scanning the front pages, experienced the familiar mental narrowing of homecoming. These were surely the very papers he had read before he left, weeks before. Here were the same headlines over the same photograph, asking the same question. When would Tony Blair go? Tomorrow? Straight after the next election, assuming he won? A year in or two, or after the whole fourth term? And was this not exactly the same number of Shia citizens in Baghdad slaughtered by Al-Qaeda as they queued to buy bread? That story apart, Beard was riffling through his pile. The tsunami had taken over 250,000 lives, which had raised for some, just as it had last month, the question of God's existence. Elsewhere, the country was, as ever, pronounced to be in ruins, its governance, finances, health service, justice and education systems, military, transport infrastructure and public morals in a state of terminal inanition. From habit, he looked out for climate change articles. Nothing today. Solar? Nothing. But there would be soon. He put away the papers, leaned back in his seat and half closed his eyes. Right before him on the table, shimmering through his barely parted lashes, were his salt and vinegar chips. And just beyond the packet was a plastic bottle of mineral water belonging to the young man. Beard wondered whether he should be looking over the notes for his speech, but general travel fatigue as well as the lunchtime drinks had rendered him, for the moment, inert, and he believed he knew the material well enough. And on a card in his top pocket were various useful quotes. As for the snack, he wanted it less than he had, but he still wanted it. Certain of those industrial compounds might stir his metabolism into wakefulness. It was his palate, rather than his stomach, that was looking forward to the acidic tang of the dust coating of each brittle slice. He had shown decent restraint. The train had been moving for several minutes now, and there was no good reason to hold back. He pulled himself up in his seat and leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands propping his chin for several reflective seconds. He gazed into his gaze fixed on the gaudy wrapper, silver, red and blue, with cartoon animals cavorting below a Union Jack. So childish of him, this infatuation, so weak, so harmful, a microcosm of all past errors and folly, of that impatient way he had of having to have what he wanted instantly. He took the bag in both hands and pulled its neck apart, discharging a clammy fragrance of frying fat and vinegar. It was an artful laboratory simulation of the corner fish and chip shop, an enactment of fond memories and desire and nationhood. That flag was a considered choice. He lifted clear a single crisp chip between forefinger and thumb, replaced the bag on the table and sat back. He was a man to take his pleasures seriously. The trick was to set the fragment on the center of the tongue and, after a moment's spreading sensation, push the potato up hard to shatter against the roof of the mouth. His theory was that the rigid, irregular surface caused tiny abrasions in the soft flesh into which salt and chemicals poured, creating a mild and distinctive pleasure-pain. Like a master of wine at a grand tasting, he had closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was staring into the level, grey-blue gaze of the man opposite. Feeling only slightly ashamed, Beard made a gesture of impatience and looked away. He knew how he must have appeared, a plump fool of a certain age, communing intensely with a morsel of junk food. He had been behaving as though alone. So what? As long as he harmed or offended no one, that was his right. He no longer cared much for what others thought of him. There were few benefits in growing older, and this was one. In a simple assertion of selfhood, rather than to satisfy his contemptible needs, he put out a hand to take another crisp, another chip, and as he did so, met the other man's gaze. It was narrow, hard, unblinking, expressive of little beyond a ferocious curiosity. It occurred to Beard that he might be sitting across from a psychopath. So be it. He could be a bit of one himself. The salty residue from the first round gave him the impression that he was bleeding from the gums. He slumped back in his seat, opened his mouth, and repeated the experience, although this time he kept his eyes open. Inevitably, the second chip was less piquant, less surprising, less penetrating than the first. And it was precisely this shortfall, this sensual disappointment, that prompted the need, familiar to drug addicts, to increase the dose. He would eat next time 2 chips at once. It was at this moment, as he glanced up, that he witnessed his fellow passenger, sitting forward, gaze still eerily fixed, elbows on the table, perhaps in conscious parody. Then, letting one forearm drop, crane-like, down onto the bag, the man stole a crisp. Probably the largest in the packet. Held it in front of his face for a second or two, and then ate it, not with Beard's fastidiousness, but with an insolent chewing motion, with lips parted so that one could glimpse it turning to paste on his tongue. The man did not even blink, his stare was so intense. And the act was so flagrant, so unorthodox, that even Beard, who was quite capable of unconventional thought, how else had he won his prize, could only sit in frozen shock and try for dignity's sake, by remaining expressionless, to betray no sign of emotion. The 2 men were locked into each other's gaze, and now Beard was determined not to look away. No question, the man's behavior was aggressive. The act was naked theft, however trivial the goods. And if it came to physical struggle, Beard did not doubt that he would be on the floor in seconds with broken arms or head. But there was also a possibility of another element, of something playful beyond this steeliness and mockery of an older man's ridiculous pleasure in junk food. Or a tease in the old-fashioned situationist mode of a stuffy bourgeois. Or worse, the fellow believed that Beard was gay, and this was a come-on, a kind of modern opening known only to certain subgroups for whom his purple silk tie, as a hypothesis, was an accidental signal. An open invitation to seduction. Wasn't an earring in one ear or other, he had forgotten which, once a significant marker of sexual orientation? This man had 2 earrings in each ear. The physicist Michael Beard knew much about light, but about forms of public expression in contemporary culture he was in the dark. Finally, returning to his initial surmise, Beard continued to wonder if his fellow passenger was a psychiatric case on an unlicensed drug holiday from the lithium, in which case it was a bad idea to continue to stare into his eyes. At this, Beard looked away and did the only thing that came to mind. He took another chip. What did he expect? As soon as this chip was on Beard's tongue, the man's hand dropped again, and this time he took 2, just as Beard himself had intended, and ate them in the same jaunty, vulgar manner. It would surely not be a good move to snatch the bag away from the table. Too physical, too abrupt. Dangerous to be breaking new ground, inviting a scuffle. Would anyone save him if it came to that? Beard glanced around the compartment. Passengers were reading or staring numb-faced into space or out the window at the wintry West London suburbs, oblivious to the drama. What interest was there in 2 men silently sharing a snack? It was paradoxical, but as Beard saw it, there was more sense in continuing what had already begun. It did not occur to him to avoid confrontation with a stronger man by giving way and letting him have the bag to himself. Beard would not be bullied. He may be short and overweight, but he had a developed sense of justice and always stood his ground. He was capable of being reckless. There had been some ruinous consequences in the past. He took another slice of fried potato. His opponent, his stare still fixed on Beard, did the same. Then again and again, for 2 further rounds, their hands came down on the bag in steady, deliberate, rather than rapid succession, and never quite touched. When there were only 2 chips left, the young man retrieved the bag and, in a parody of politeness, offered them to Beard. The only response to this, the final insult, was to turn away. It was an outrage. The train was beginning to slow. People were reaching for their coats. A computerized voice reminded passengers not to leave the train without their luggage. In a move that secured his triumph, the young man balled up in his fist the plastic bag and stuffed it into the waste bin under the table. Diligently, he used a hand to wipe the table clear of crumbs and grains of salt. Beard's humiliation was complete. This was how it was to grow older, to be pushed around by the young, the strong, and have no redress. With a warming touch of self-pity, he sensed that every injustice, every historical oppression, unwarranted invasion, chaotic warlordism, every tyrannical break with the rule of law was compacted in this moment, and he was bound by self-respect and his duty to underdogs everywhere to make a show of resistance. Otherwise, he could never live with himself. He lunged forward, seized his opponent's bottle of water, snapped off its top and drank deeply. He was thirsty anyway. Drank it down to the bottom, every last drop of its 25 centiliters. He tossed the bottle onto the table with a defiant, come-and-get-me look. The blue bottle cap rolled onto the floor. The young man thought for a moment, then stood and stepped into the aisle, revealing his full height, somewhere around 6'2". Beard, already beginning to regret his defiance, remained in his seat, determined not to cringe. The man reached up, and with one smooth movement of his overdeveloped arm, he swung Beard's luggage to the floor, setting it down gently by its owner. If this was an act of contrition, Beard was not moved, and he returned a snarling look of contempt. His adversary hesitated a moment, gazing down at the older man with an expression of sorrow or pity. Then he turned and loped away down the aisle. Beard let him get well clear before he stood. He never wanted to see that fellow again. A full minute passed before he stepped out onto the platform. Trembling a little now, with anger or shock or a little of both, he had some difficulty getting himself into his coat. Its belt was tangled around a sleeve. His shoelace was loose. As he knelt to retie it with fingers not yet fully obedient, he remembered his heap of newspapers and decided to leave them where they were. And at last, more or less composed, he made his way along the platform towards the ticket barrier. And this was the moment that would remain with him and come to stand for every recalculation he would ever make about his past, every revised or improved perspective he would ever gain on his own history, his own stupidity, and other people's motives. He stopped 20 feet short of the ticket barrier. He set his wheeled luggage on end and reached under his coat into his jacket pocket for the ticket. There was something else in there, something plastic, bulky, lightweight, crunchy. There came to him a confused childhood memory. There came to him a confused childhood memory of a magic trick at a village fete, when some master of the art had pulled from the 10-year-old Michael Beard's ear an egg, or a rabbit, or a chicken, something physically impossible, just like this. His crisps, his chips, the ones he had already eaten. He pulled the bag clear and, stupefied, stared at it. The Union Jack, the dancing cartoon animals, willing them to melt away. And that other bag. What a cascade of recalibration of every instant, every impulse, of the nature of the man he never wanted to see again. And of how he, Michael Beard, must have seemed, a vicious madman. He was so entirely in the wrong that for the moment it felt like liberation, strangely, like joy. There could be no excuses. He had no defense. He felt a mirthless impulse to laugh. His error was so unambiguous, so unsullied. He stood so completely revealed to himself, a naked fool, that he felt purified and redeemed, like a penitent, like an elated medieval flagellant with a newly flayed back. That poor fellow whose food and drink you devoured, who offered you his last morsels, fetched down your luggage, was a friend to man. No, that was not for now. The agony of retrospection must be postponed. Despite the need to hurry to his appointment, he remained on the busy platform a good while, below the distant glass roof and its clattering echoes, while passengers stepped around him, and he held the bag of chips against his chest, feeling himself, quite mistakenly, intensely illuminated. Now, to end, I'm going to just read a little coda. Michael Beard hurries to the Savoy Hotel in London to deliver a long, impassioned speech about climate change, and gets a bit stuck. He eats too many salmon sandwiches just before the lecture and feels intensely sick. In fact, pops behind a curtain to be sick. But at the end of his speech, he suddenly gets a bit stuck and he wants to find a metaphor of sudden transformation in what we understand. And so he tells the story of what happened to him that afternoon on the train. And so he's contractually obliged to mingle with his audience for half an hour. And there are only 11 minutes left. And an academic with a jutting beard, who he'd met beforehand, he was dealing with various points of conversation and accepting a second glass of wine, even though he knew it was time for a scotch, when suddenly the lecturer, Mellon, was there, waiting eagerly with trembling beard for a break in the conversation. When it came, he said, "I'd love to know where you got that story from." "What story?" Beard said. "You know, the one about the man on the train." "As I said," Beard said, "it happened to me this afternoon." "Come now, Professor Beard, we're all grown-ups here." The fund managers, sensing that one man was calling another to account, pressed in to hear above the din of voices. Beard said, "I've lost you, you'll have to explain." Mellon said, "You told it very well, and I can see it suited your purposes." "You think I made it up?" "On the contrary, it's a well-known tale with many variants, much studied in my field. It even has a name, The Unwitting Thief." "Really," Beard said coldly, "how interesting." "Actually, it is. Across the variants are some stable characteristics. For example, the wrongly accused is generally a marginal figure, often threatening, a tinker, an immigrant, a punk, even someone with a disability. Your well-built young man with the earrings fits perfectly. The wrongly accused usually performs an act of kindness for the unwitting thief. And this makes the moment of truth all the more agonizing. In your case, he lifts down your luggage. One theory is that the tale of the unwitting thief, it's known in the field, by the way, as UT, but one theory is that it expresses anxiety and guilt about our hostility towards minorities. Perhaps it acts in the culture as an unconscious corrective. It must have occurred to you, Beard said, determined to smile, that now and then it actually happens that people's stories are real. You know, in an age of mass transport, people squashed up together, carrying food in identical wrappers. "What interests us," said Mellon, "is the way the tale passes in and out of fashion, goes from lip to lip, falls from view, reappears a few years later in a different form by a process we call communal recreation. UT was widely known in the United States in the early 1900s. We don't have records of it here until the 1950s, and by the early 70s it was everywhere. And then the writer Douglas Adams put a version of it in a novel in the mid-80s. He always insisted that it had actually happened to him on a train. And that's another common feature. By claiming it as a personal experience, people localize and authenticate the story. It happened to them, it happened to a friend of theirs, and they insulate it from the archetype. They make it original. They claim copyright. UT has appeared in stories by Jeffrey Archer and, I think, by Roald Dahl. It's been told as a true story on the BBC and in the Guardian newspaper. It's the plot of at least 2 films, The Lunch Date and Birth Bourguignon. And there's also, I'm very sorry to disappoint you, Beard said, but my experience belongs to me and not the bloody collective unconscious. The folklorist had a certain autistic doggedness. Yes, what's new about your version is the chips. I've heard biscuits, apples, cigarettes. Whole canteen lunches, never chips. I might write it up for the Contemporary Legend Quarterly, if you don't mind. I'll change your name, of course. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Crisps in train, number 1.
I like to please.
Number 2, I actually ranked 2 because we had to sign that thing about how we wouldn't say or do anything obscene on stage. And
Yeah, that's
so
the only bit I could find.
you know which scene I meant from number 2. And you will find it in the book. I was thinking as I was listening to you read, especially lovingly, the airplane lunch and his resistance and then capitulation to it, that you must have a fat man trapped inside this thin man.
Well, I do have a bit of a fat man trapped inside me. I think everyone has a fat man trapped either inside or outside them. I'm not only the oldest I've ever been in my life, I'm also the heaviest I've ever been in my life. And for those of us who are past the age of 35, it's a strange factor of metabolism. One gets heavier, and one looks at photographs of oneself in other days and thinks you were young and you didn't even know it. That how easy it was to stuff yourself to the gills every day and never, against all the laws of thermodynamics, never get heavier. Extraordinary. But it's very hard to, if you live in a country of relative plenty, when that stuff is put in front of you, it requires some resolve. And I think, that's writ large is an issue for whole nations, too.
It's interesting. It came across very well when you read aloud how funny this book is. It's certainly one of your funniest. And there's an element of cruelty, I suppose you'd call it, in your treatment of Michael Beard, but there's also a great deal of affection and insight and even taking his viewpoint a lot. And I thought with just a little bit of a push toward more being inside him and thinking that he was right about everything, he would have turned into a Kingsley Amis character. Did you ever think that he was in any way like that?
It's a matter of having it both ways. So there's plenty in Michael Beard that I would dissociate myself from, but every now and then I can sound off about something which I couldn't really defend if it was coming from me, but I can give to him and hide behind his bulk.
His complaining about the ponytails, for instance, at his workplace.
Oh, yes. Well, he has the sort of anxiety of the elderly academic in that he's not as fast as he was on his feet. He knows roughly his way around the mathematics of string theory, for example, but his young postgraduates are sort of way ahead. They're into M theory and beyond superstring theory. And he is very irritated that when he goes home just to look up some of their remarks, to find that it takes him such an effort to read all this, that even the following morning he's still got the frown marks from trying to take on just how complex this world is. And he has an intuition that it can't be. God couldn't possibly be that clever, he feels. And nor could he be such a show-off, and that there must be some simpler thing. But behind that wish is the fact that he's struggling to keep up. But some of it is a matter of having it both ways, and my guide in this is John Updike. He showed you how you could have a man of limited education, not particularly bright, although quite incisive, not particularly nice, I'm talking of Rabbit, and yet Updike managed to pour all of himself into this man and chart through the prism of this man's consciousness the United States changing through for 40 years, and also the very fine small print of the disastrous private family relationships that Harry Angstrom has. It's a fantastic feat of rhetoric, actually, to be in this character but not quite in him, to give him language that he could not possibly have. But it seemed to me to open up freedom to us lesser mortals who somehow want to have a bad person at the centre of things and yet also use that bad person to sometimes speak and rattle off against some suspicions you have about the modern world or postmodern academia or the British press, or, you know.
I have a vague feeling that Updike may not have thought Rabbit was as bad as you do, or as bad as you think Michael is. That is, I bet he identified with him more than you identify with Michael.
Well, I know for a fact that John Updike would not sleep with his son's wife.
Oh, well, yes, the extreme situations. How can you know anything for a fact about another human being? And I see that you've not committed yourself to 4 volumes of Beard Chronicles because you've kind of done a minute at the end.
I have neither the talent nor the stamina of John Updike, that's true.
Did you, when you got to the end of Solar, think about the end of The Innocent? Was that ending in your mind at all?
No.
Because I distinctly remember that you asked me to read the last page of The Innocent again after I'd read it once, and you said, "What do you think is happening to him here?" And I said nothing. I couldn't tell what was happening to him.
The last page of The Innocent?
And you said he was having a heart attack.
Of The Innocent?
Am I confusing the novels? The guy, it's the special relationship, yeah, the one that goes to Berlin. Isn't he the one?
The last page of The Innocent, and this is going back 25 years, he thinks he must meet up with his old lover and come and see the Berlin Wall together before they tear it down.
Oh, then I'm confusing it with another novel. There's a novel that you insisted he was having a heart attack at the end. But I couldn't tell. But here I could tell.
Right, okay. I have this recurrent dream. I go to my desk and I pull out a drawer, and there is that novel that I wrote that I forgot about.
Maybe we're talking about that hidden one.
Now, I didn't think you would have read it.
So the science in Solar seems very good. I mean, I don't know the science, so I can't tell, but it does seem real and persuasive, and as if you had definitely studied it up.
Some of it is completely fictional. Michael Beard gets his Nobel Prize for modifying Albert Einstein's work on photovoltaics, for which Einstein got his Nobel Prize. Now, I wrote all this with no idea what Michael Beard did to Einstein's. I just thought the fact that it's called the Beard-Einstein conflation had a sort of ring about it. And I was in the Galapagos Islands last year, and I happened to run into a physicist and a mathematician from Cambridge, England. And I asked him if he would mind reading my final draft of the novel and then reverse engineering the physics and then write the Nobel Prize citation for Michael Beard's Nobel Prize. And this is Dr. Graham Mitchison, a man of huge accomplishments. He's a fantastic piano player, apart from anything else. And he has a real taste for intellectual mischief. And he came up with the appendix of this book, which describes exactly, in terms that a layman can almost understand, just what the work is and how it's backed up and how it was discovered by Richard Feynman, So it's all sort of slotted into real physics, but it is fictional. But the rest of the physics, the rest of the artificial photosynthesis is all true, except we're nowhere near being able to build an industrial scale thing in the desert. But it is happening on lab benches around the world as we speak.
Isn't one of your sons a scientist? Something to do with leaves and plants and things?
One of my sons is a geneticist, but not working with leaves.
So nothing that would pertain to photosynthesis.
No.
I'm going to alternate my questions with audience questions.
Okay.
There were quite a number of interesting ones, and we selected out the ones we thought would, produce the most fascinating answer or make the author feel most thrilled to hear it read aloud. But anyway, here's one. You once defined cruelty as a failure of the imagination and praised the novel for its ability to inhabit other people's minds. To what extent did you conceive of Michael Beard as a scientist who might, unlike Joe Rose or Henry Perrown, truly benefit from reading fiction?
There's not much help in the novel in this regard. Michael Beard's young postdoc, the one whose ideas he's going to pinch, does afflict and oppress Beard by thrusting novels on Michael Beard. And Michael Beard simply says to himself, "Novels!" ! In other words, it wouldn't occur to him to read a novel. It's a very interesting question. Does reading novels make people better? I think the jury is really out on that. Mm-hmm. Does art make people better? I don't know. If only it did. We'd be sitting in a room of virtuous people.
And we know we are not.
Just know we're not. George Steiner has laid out for us the fact that there were terrible death camps in Poland whose commandants listened to Schubert. And that enigma has not been solved for us. I would like to think that a man with such short-range radar on other people could have his sensibilities modified by reading a novel. But liking to think that is not the same as believing it is so.
Yes, and many novelists of one's acquaintance are cruel and abrupt people also. So
it's a race of beasts. No, novelists, and yes, terrible people.
There seemed to be an interesting sort of game between the two cultures, between science and literature, going on in the flashback to his college years, where he seduces what will become his first wife by studying up on Milton. And he does it in 1 week, and then he says to himself, nobody could learn all my science in this way. You couldn't just quickly do physics the way I've quickly learned English literature. I mean, did you agree with him there, or did you think he was...
Well, this was an instance of crawling behind the bulk of Michael Beard in order to voice a sort of prejudice that I couldn't really defend in public. But it goes something like this. Well, I'm going to say it in public, but I'm not going to defend it. Maybe the study of English literature in universities is a complete waste of time. And I say this because I've met many scientists over the last few years, and many of them are deeply literate men and women, and they're able to talk about the novels and poems that I like, the music that I like, the operas, but I'm not able to talk to them about the science that they like. And it seems a one-way trade. And it goes something like this, that the scientists that I remember from when I was at university had to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and go to their first lecture at 9 a.m., and it would be lectures all the way through till 6. They would be doing practicals, 5.5 day, 6-day week. They would have to get their minds, especially the physicists and mathematicians, around some of the most difficult things ever thought. What were we doing? We were lying in bed till 2 p.m., turning up for 1 or 2 tutorials a week, every now and then gripped by a panic for an essay, but not too often, and sailing out with moderately good or even good degrees. How how could we really call that work?
Well, but
It was a sort of finishing school. And it was so you could hold up your end at a dinner party table for the rest of your life. And to look down on the scientists at the same time. So what a monstrous fraud has been perpetuated here. When I did a brief teaching stint at Caltech, and the students were ferociously clever, and they're all doing degrees in physics and maths. But on the side, in their spare time, they were doing an English degree, just to sort of keep busy.
But has
and
it
that
occurred
made
to
me
you?
feel really small. So I don't know if I could put this forward as an educational policy, but I have got my suspicions that the whole thing is a monstrous fraud.
But just as we don't know whether art is any good for people or not, it's possible that laziness is good for people. We don't know, but it may produce something.
Yeah, but when you go to see the doctor, if he said, well, I was a really lazy medical student.
Yeah, only in the arts. Here's another audience question. Your plot often pivots on a seemingly inconsequential moment, which, depending on the character's reaction, drastically alters his/her fate. Is this because you have experienced such a moment yourself?
Well, this question is put to me in various forms, though never quite so concisely as this. And I'm a bit baffled by it. I like things to happen in a novel, and if anything's going to happen, it's usually got to happen by surprise. Most terrible things in life, apart from slow, lingering deaths, happen by surprise. I mean, most bad things. So, I don't know. I don't feel that I'm any different from anyone else who wants a stiffly plotted novel. And so, sooner or later, something is going to have to happen. And then the narrative is going to accelerate. A different kind of pulse has got to hit the prose. And the characters are all going to go off in a slightly different direction. I mean, but hasn't that all happened to Odysseus by the time he gets to Ithaca? I mean, lots of things like that.
But that's what I mean about you being a throwback to the older style.
Oh,
having a real plot.
I didn't know you meant to Homer, but okay.
I meant... Speaking of have things ever happened to you, did the Crisps experience happen to you? Or
No. I heard it on the radio.
And did you hear it was an urban legend?
And I thought, what an amazing true story. And I put it in a notebook, and then I heard it again in a different form. And then I thought, well, I'll definitely put that in a novel. Then I read that extract at a literary festival, and someone stood up and accused me of being a plagiarist from Douglas Adams. So I thought, okay, he's going in too. Something self-protect. I looked it up. There are contemporary legend sites, and you can look it up. That story goes the rounds. It takes on fantastically diverse forms. For example, one form that's been going around the States in the last 10 years is a guy gets a flat tire, stops by the side of the road, a stranger stops in his car, helps him change the tire. When the driver gets back in his car, he notices that the wallet, his pocketbook that he left on the seat, is gone. He runs after the guy who helped him. Just as he's getting into the car, takes a swing at him. The guy reels back. The original driver with the flat tire gets in his car, goes home. What does he see on his bed but his pocketbook? That is just another form of the legend of the unwitting thief.
It's probably not a legend. It probably happens a lot.
Yeah, okay.
All right, another audience question. Your writing often delves into disturbing, shocking, surprising, and even disgusting subject matter. However, you approach these subjects with delicate and lush prose. I'm not sure I read that properly, but
Yep.
In the 21st century, when so many people have been desensitized in regard to shocking and disturbing events and scenarios, how do you, as a writer, go about bringing readers back to a place in which these events mean something again? Do you believe there will ever come a time at which nothing will be shocking in our society?
God, I hope not. We'd have to be automata or psychopaths. I think the question raises some interesting points about character. Character in fiction. In other words, it's very hard to care much about what happens to people in a novel, whether it's shocking or disgusting or, for that matter, exhilarating and ecstatic, unless you can devise imaginary beings that are plausible, which is why I part company enormously and profoundly with Virginia Woolf, who said famously that in the novel the character is dead. She was dismissing the 19th century. I think the invention of character in the 19th century was the development, the evolution of complex character in 19th century fiction was a fantastic gift that the 19th century made to the 20th. We then had literary modernism, which was another gift, which gave us another sort of turn of the screw on our understanding of the relationship between the novel and the real things that it describes. But I see no reason to junk the characters as well. And the great monument of modernist fiction, Ulysses, has some of the shining realist characters that have ever been devised in Bloom and Stephen. So as long as we can, as novelists, devise plausible consciousnesses into which people can pour their own sense of relation to, then everything that happens in the novel will matter, and the shock, the thrill will hold. And I can't see, unless human nature changes, how that could ever change.
Which Virginia Woolf thought it had in January of 1910 or something. I'm totally with you on that. Against Virginia Woolf and for Arnold Bennett. In that battle that she had in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, I come out on his side every time.
I think it's an age thing.
We're too old.
I know you're very young, but I think that there was a revolutionary thrill in saying the character is dead. But look at the second half of the 20th century in American writing. Somehow, in ways that European writing did not manage, the great American writers of the second half of the 20th century managed to learn all the lessons of modernism, but not abandon character. And you get it in Toni Morrison, you get it in Saul Bellow and Updike and dozens of others. And you see it in Richard Ford or Toby Wolfe. Character is central to this writing. Whereas, you go on book tour in Germany, in Italy, they are amazed that writers are still bothering with character. And it's changed a bit in the last 10 or 15 years, but the existential sort of postmodern novel has really had a long life. Characters waking up in a hotel with no name, in a city with no identity, waiting for a phone call from someone they don't know. I'm being a bit cruel, but there is a certain kind of stock in trade of novels that had to flounder in the long shadow cast by the great writers of the early 20th century. And all the American writers that I admire, and there are many, have leapt clear of that by having the lessons of modernism and, at the same time, keeping faith with character.
Well, it may be partly because we started with the other. That is, if you look at the 19th century, Moby Dick is as out there and abstract as you can get. Yeah. Huckleberry Finn actually wakes up with a different name in every town he wakes up in. So the novel was already doing those advanced things in America in the 19th century.
Yeah, and in England in the 18th, might I add.
And what?
In Tristram Shandy and so on.
What do you think about the English during this period of the second half of the 20th century? Do you care to say something?
We floundered a long time in a rather sad decline of a rather provincial kind of writing that was fairly unambitious, quite nicely modulated, And I think things began to loosen up a bit in the late 70s, early 80s. Why? Partly because we started reading writers of another English coming into our country, and partly because I think a new generation of writers loved American fiction, and then we also fell in love with South American fiction. This widened the horizons enormously, and it helped us to become a little more ambitious. But certainly when I started writing, British fiction in the sort of 60s and early 70s was, with the exception, I'd say, of William Golding, largely nicely modulated, socially observant fiction of a sort of semi-documentary nature.
You were considered a very nasty piece of work when you first came out as a short story writer, and then as the novelist of The Cement Garden. I mean, people thought you had crawled out from under something.
Well, I had, in a sense. I mean, what I crawled out from under was this heavy hand of an unexamined social realism in the British novel. So if you were young and you wanted to be a kind of fauviste, there were many places to go. You could write like Borges, or you could write like the Philip Roth of Portnoy's Complaint, or you could even reach back to Kafka. There were many possibilities. I was much taken with The Naked Lunch of William Burroughs and the writing of Genet. There were ways out, and it was amazingly easy to shock people too. And although I pretended I didn't want to shock anyone, looking back, I realize now I absolutely did.
And succeeded. I mean, The Comfort of Strangers is still one of the most upsetting novels that I have ever recommended to people. And I'm now careful about who I recommend it to, because it's set in Venice, and I recommended it to someone who was going on vacation in Venice and got there and read it, and he just was so enraged at me for ruining his vacation.
No, he's dead right. And I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's certainly, it was the darkest, most depressing thing I ever wrote, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone at all. Paul Schrader made a movie of it with a Harold Pinter screenplay, which was sort of beautiful, but
very strange to hear your material ground through the Harold Pinter machine and come out something oddly different. I mean, it was a very weird experience.
Christopher Walken is in it, and he looks so much like Harold Pinter, and talks like him even. I think they must have hung out together a bit.
Because normally he certainly didn't.
Yeah. No, I was very pleased that Pinter did that.
It was a scary movie too, and Christopher Walken was very good at being menacing, as he always is. Yeah. One of the members of the audience wanted to know whether you were at all influenced by J.D. Salinger, who is much in people's minds since he just died.
Influence in the sense that I loved the short stories and read them over and over, and those stories like Perfect Day for Banana Fish and so on. I didn't feel any direct influence, but anything you read and like intensely is bound to shape you in some way or another, but it's hard to identify what it is. I love the shape of those stories. I mean, they were so perfectly turned. I assume that he's been writing all this while, and that every 2 or 3 years now a novel will appear, and we'll find out.
I wouldn't count on it, but you never know. What reading shaped you in your childhood? Do you remember what books you cared about?
Well, I came from a very non-literary household, but my parents, who both left school at 14, had a very strong sense of the value of an education, the value of books, and we lived in North Africa. My father was, I'm an army brat, we posted to North Africa, and every Tuesday evening we'd go to the army library, which was not very extensive. Now, neither of my parents ever had books in childhood, so they had no sense of the classics of childhood. So I was left free to wander these shelves, not very extensive, maybe 500 books, and had to make my own way through. So I discovered a writer who, for many years in the 60s and 70s, was banned from English public libraries because she was thought to be such a bad influence. And her name was Enid Blyton. I thought she was fantastic. And I read all those Island and Castles of Adventure. And then I liked novels about a man called Biggles. He was a sort of ace fighter pilot, soldier, sailor, Superman, but within the realms of realism. And there was another man, now more obscure, no one's really heard of him, called Gimlet. And many of the Gimlet stories were set in the Second World War. And Gimlet did things like swim across the English Channel with a knife between his teeth and take out a nest, a machine gun nest of Nazis and swim back before breakfast and think nothing of it. So I liked those stories. And then when it was suggested in our household that I might be sent away to boarding school, my parents must have asked around because suddenly stories about boarding schools began to appear. And there was a boy called Jennings who had lots of adventures in a boarding school. And I read all those. I read all the Just William books, William,
yep.
Richmond Crompton.
I don't know if we had them over here. Did we? No, I don't think so.
It's a very English thing.
Yeah.
William was a sort of slouching, untidy boy, the sort of boy who had a frog in one pocket and a toad and a catapult in another. And there was a girl called Elizabeth Violet Booth with a lisp who was very posh. She was 5 years old and was always attaching herself to William and his gang. His gang was called the Outlaws. And these novels were all set in times of rationing and in the 40s. So there are others too, but I think I'd bore you if I went through the whole list.
Let me ask an audience question about endings. This person felt that you do something tricky at the end of certain endings, Amsterdam, Atonement, Saturday, that's kind of a twist, and wanted to know, the exact wording is this whimsy or teasing? It seems to me that whimsy can be teasing and vice versa, but how do you respond to that?
Well, the ending of Atonement is rather distinct from the others. That was a novel in the form, really, of an extended conversation about where the imagination sits, as it were, in our thoughts and how we stand in relation to the novel and how we take into ourselves what actually happens. Otherwise, no, I think endings are crucial and difficult. You want to avoid glib optimism. You want to avoid the sound of knots being tied, and everything being cut and dried. Teasing the reader, less so. I mean, I'm by habit an empiricist. I think that the world is out there and can be described, and that there's a reality which we can all attest to. I don't go with everyone having his or her own truth. So if that reader feels teased or I'm being whimsical, then I feel misread.
Good. And I think that note about the reality that's out there is a very good place to leave. It's an important thing about the novel, and it's an important thing about your novel. So thank you, and thank you all for being here.